also in step 8 we have these two bulges to add onto the top surface of the wings. Now earlier we drilled some holes. Now if you have a drill, that's great, and the part has two little pips underneath which locate in those holes. You may find that you have to make the holes a little bit wider to get them to fit in, so we'll have a look at that in a moment. Now on this other wing we didn't drill holes, so if you didn't have a drill and were not able to drill the holes, then what you can do is carefully remove the pips with a knife and then finish the job with a little bit of sanding. So if you hold the part very carefully between your thumb and your finger and just cut one pip off, and then turn it around and cut the other pip off, and then just sand it smooth. Now be careful that you don't damage the part, because the part is slightly curved to fit the top of the wing. So I would do one pip at a time. Like so, so that your surface is nice and smooth, and then you can glue it on. Now it's not difficult to get the right position because it goes right next to a panel line on the wing, so it's quite easy. If you see where the holes are, there's a panel line right next to it, so it's quite easy just to put a little bit of glue on and place it where you want it, and that'll stay on nicely. Now if you did drill holes and you want to use the pins to locate it, you will find that the holes, as they've advised, are slightly undersized, and that means that the two little pips underneath are too big for the holes and the part won't sit in properly. So what you can do with your knife is just put it in the hole and give it a gentle twist round, and that will just open the hole up. Can you see the difference? And do the same with that one. Now less is more when it comes to doing that. If you make the hole too big, the part will move around, and you might as well just cut the pips off, like we've done on the other one. So let's see if that fits now. It's a little tricky. Yeah, there we go. That goes in okay now. Now if you're not sure about opening the holes up and you're a youngster, pause the video, get an adult, show them what you want to do on the video, and get them to do it for you. Not too much glue, so we don't want it squeezing out all over the aeroplane wing. That looks good. So that completes our step 8. We've already put the wings on. Now the next step is to put the undercarriage on. Now, and also this part here, but only put that on, see the big question mark, only put that on if you want that up. It's actually a little step to help the pilot get onto the wing, and you can see the step there. So if you want the step down, you put it where we put it on a little later. Now I'm going to have the step down, so I'm not going to do that. If you're going to have the wheels down, which is what I'm going to do, now is the time to paint the aeroplane. If you're going to have the wings up, then I would paint the tyres and then glue these in and then paint the aeroplane. Now I will show you how to paint the tyres when I come to paint the tyres, but let's just have a look at fitting this part. So if you want to display it with the wheels up, what you'll have to do is push the part in place and just check the fit, and if it doesn't fit in perfectly even, then just keep going round with your sanding stick, with your emery board, smoothing off the edges until you can get it to fit in. Quite often they're a bit of a tight fit and you just need to help it fit properly. Make sure that you clean up your seam on your tyre, and then paint your tyre and your wheel hub, which is the 145 colour, before you glue it in place. The rest of it, however, you can paint when we paint the rest of the wing. Now I'm going to show my wheels down because we see a little bit more detail that way. So with that in mind, let's paint. Now when we look at the paint instructions, which are on the back of the box, you can see there's a lighter colour at the bottom and then two darker colours making a camouflage pattern on the top. I think it's always best to start with painting the light colours first, because if you paint the dark colours, when you come to paint the light colours, you might see the dark colour coming through underneath. So I always start with the light colours. So if, like me, your paint has got very thick in the pot, don't worry about it. Try and take all the paint that's in the lid back into the pot and give it a good mix, and that'll help a little bit. And then when we put it in our palette or our bottle top and add some water, it'll thin down and be perfectly good for using. So don't worry if your paint appears to be a little bit thick. Doesn't mean you can't use it. So we're going to thin this paint with the water like we did before. And we don't need to put too much in because we can always go back and get some more if we need to. Okay, so we're going to start with painting the underneath, and what we want to do is give everything a nice even cover. So just go over the area once and then we'll let it dry. Try and be as neat as possible when you get to edges, but don't worry, every time you make a model you'll get better and better every time. Now sometimes when you put your first coat of paint on, because we're not using something called primer, you might find that the paint just separates a little bit. Even though you've washed the parts, don't worry about that, the second coat won't separate. this lighter colour comes up the side, and what you want to do is paint a little higher than you think it looks like. So don't worry about putting the waves in. See the waves there? You don't need to worry about that. Just paint a bit beyond it and we'll put the waves in when we paint the camouflage pattern. So I'm going a little bit higher because I know I can paint over it and that won't be a problem. Once you've got your first coat on, put it to one side and leave it to dry. So we're going to build the bomb now, which is 2 parts which go together quite easily. And the best thing to do once you've cut it from the sprue, once you've cut it off the sprue, is just to lay it on your cutting mat or your piece of cardboard and just trim down what's left of the sprue as close as you can, just like you've done before, and then sand it smooth before you glue the 2 halves together. Now there is a bit of a trick to sanding circles, so don't worry if you change the shape of it and make it a little bit flat, but do your best not to. Okay, so we know that fits together okay, so let's get some glue on that. And just very carefully spread it on the edges that are going to stick together and put some in those little holes where the little location pins will go in. And push it together and put it to one side to dry. So when the first coat of paint has dried, and it won't take long, we're ready to put a second coat on, and we're going to give that a second coat before we put the other paints on. We want to get this one right before we do the others. Now you can afford on the second coat of paint to make that paint a little bit thinner than your first layer, because if we do that it goes further for a start, but also it will level out the unevenness of your first paint. So you can see brush strokes, we've got little areas where it wouldn't settle, and by just making the paint a little bit thinner we can cover that and give ourselves a smoother finish. Do you see? Now what you'll notice is I'm using the brush that way rather than using the end, which we did when we put the first coat on, and dragging it across to use the whole width of the bristles so that we get less brush strokes. So that's a good little trick when you're putting thin paint on and want to cover up some brush strokes. Don't worry if it looks like you've got too much paint on. When the paint dries, it will sort of shrink down onto the plastic, and it won't look like you've got too much on. But try not to put too much on, because what you don't want is to cause runs and drips, which might just spoil the look of your model when it's finished. Now, I need a little bit more paint, so I'll come back to you when we've given it a second coat. So we're now ready to paint the next colour on. So when we look at the instructions, we can see that there's a grey and there's like a greeny grey colour. And what we're going to do is we're going to do the grey next, because that's the next lightest colour. And rather than worrying about trying to do the pattern, what we're going to do is we're going to paint everything in that grey. Even where the grey green is, we'll paint all of that grey, and then we can put the grey green on afterwards. So let's do that. I've already thinned my paint. Now this part here that we've decided to leave off until a little bit later, and we'll show you why later. If you can find some blue tack, that's a really good way of painting it without getting your fingers on it. If you don't have any blue tack and can't find any blue tack, then your other option is just to hold it and paint one side, and then when that's dried, hold the painted side and paint the other side. Right, we can let that dry and come back to it in a bit for a second coat. So my second coat of the dark grey is now dry, and you can see how the second coat of paint really makes a difference to the overall finish. So all the patchiness and brush strokes that were there after the first coat of paint have gone away. Now if you feel that there is still a little bit of patchiness and you want to do a third coat, that's quite alright. Just make your third coat a little bit thinner again than the second coat, and that should even things out nicely. You shouldn't need more than 3 coats. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is the sort of green grey colour, which is the camouflage. Now what I would say is at this stage use the instructions as a guide, but you can do your own pattern. There were so many different patterns, it really doesn't matter if it's not 100% accurate. So just do what you feel looks right and use that as a guide. So let's get that paint thinned with a bit of water, and then I'll get back to you when we're ready to paint. So because the paint that we're going to put on for the camouflage is going on top of paint that's already there, we don't need the paint to be quite as thick as when we put a first coat on directly on plastic. So you can make it a little thinner if you like, but not so thin that it's sort of see-through. So we're going to start our painting on the wings, so you can see how we're going about that. Now a lot of people make the mistake of putting the outline in first, and I don't think that's a very good idea. So what we'll do is we'll start by marking out sort of the middle area, and then we make it larger until we get it to the size we want. Now the reason that I like to do it that way is because when you first put your paintbrush on the model, it has the most amount of paint on it, and it sort of forms a little circle. So you end up with more paint when you first put the brush down than you may have when you've moved the paint around a bit with your brush. So I like to work out to the edge So it's roughly a triangle like that. I think we'll make it a little wider. And you don't want it too straight, it's a camouflage pattern. But don't make it too complicated either, because ultimately you've got to put a second coat over the top of it. Okay, so that's the first wing done. So I will carry on and do this through the rest of the aeroplane, and I will show you what that looks like when we come to do the second coat. Now, some of your camouflage has to go across this area here, and we've not glued this part in yet, and we still don't want to glue this part in. But what you can do is just push it into place, click it in, so that you can paint the camouflage on, and then when the paint is dry, you can take it back off again, because we need to paint the machine guns before we glue it down, and we'll do that when we're painting the black. So also in the painting instructions, we need to do this little bit of camouflage on the tail, these little spots. So let me show you how I go about doing that. So we have our paint here. This is the paint we've used for the camouflage pattern on the rest of the aeroplane. So what we're going to do is dip the brush in, so there's a little bit of paint on the tip of the paintbrush, and then we're just going to wipe it off. So there is still some paint on there. I've not given it a good wipe, I've not tried to clean it, I've just taken most of the wet paint off so that I've only got a small amount on the brush. And then we're just going to dab where we want to spot. That's a little hard to see. What we're doing is we're putting a small amount on, and by taking the paint off the brush, we've just got a little bit more control over where we're putting the paint. It's as simple as that, really. Just make sure you've not got too much paint on your brush. If you don't think there's enough paint on it, you can always put more. So now our first coat of the camouflage paint is dry, we can thin our paint out and give it a second coat, and we do that exactly the same as we did before. We start in the middle and we move out to the edges, this time trying to keep within the lines that you've painted first time. If you go over it, the danger is that you'll have two different thicknesses of paint and it'll look a bit different. Don't worry if you do, especially if this is your first time. It all comes with practice, like everything. So I'll come back to you when I've finished. So our camouflage is all dry now. I'd recommend leaving it at least half an hour before you do anything. It can look dry and even be dry to the touch, but it's still a little soft underneath, and it needs to cure hard underneath if you're going to be handling it. But that looks really good now, so we're ready to do the next bit, which is the little black areas where the exhausts are, and also this bit in front of the pilot, which is inside the canopy of the cockpit. So we're going to do that bit first. Now, Airfix don't explicitly tell you to paint this black, but when you look at the paint instructions, it is black. So, makes sense to me. just make sure when you paint it that you get the little lip on the inside as well, just there. Otherwise you'll be able to see the plastic once the glass canopy is on. Okay, so we need to paint this area here. So we're painting up to the end of that little lump that comes out. There's two of them, painting up to that second one, and then all the way back to the exhausts. Like that. It will need two coats like everything has. It's just a matter of not having too much paint on your brush, keeping your hand as steady as possible. Okay, we'll let that dry, give it a second coat, and then I'll come back to you. And while we've got our black paint out, we can now finally paint these machine guns. And make sure you paint underneath them. Easy to forget that bit. And the ends. And these will now really stand out when we glue this part onto the aeroplane. So now all of our paints have dried, we can finally glue this piece into place. And the best way to do that is to put a little bit of glue on the inside of each side of the part there, because that's the bit that is least likely to have glue squeeze out from. So just put a small amount on. It doesn't need a lot to hold it in place. Don't be tempted to put glue on these two surfaces here. You only need enough to hold it in place, and it's much more likely to ooze out of there. So we won't do that. And then we can put our part in. Now this fits quite tightly, so it needs a bit of a push. There we go. And you can see how we've been able to paint the machine guns without getting any paint on it or them getting in the way. And that now looks really good, I think. So we're now at this part of building our model, putting the wheels on and putting the step on. We'll do these at the same time because we're painting the same colours, so it just makes it a little bit quicker and easier. When we've got the paint out for painting these, we can be painting these as well. Now, if this isn't your first model and you happen to have silver paint, then if you see here on the instructions there's a little lighter colour. Well, we haven't got paint for that in our box, but if you've built a model before and you happen to have silver paint, you could paint that little section silver, and that would just make it look even better. So that little bit there. But don't worry if you've not, it'll still look good painted up. So what we need to do is get our parts, cut them off the sprue, and tidy them up as best we can with our little emery board and our knife to make it nice and clean and get all the extra plastic off, ready for gluing in place. Now when you have a part that's going to be difficult for you to get in with your emery board to sand it down, like this part here, we've got 2 bits of sprue that we need to take away, then the best thing to do is to cut them away with a knife. Just use the point of the knife and press down very gently to break it off. You need to do it on your cutting mat or your bit of folded up cardboard so that you don't damage the work surface that you're working on, especially if it's your dining table. Don't want to get into trouble. And then don't forget, you can always cut a little strip off that's just the right width to go in and take off what you need without doing any sanding away of the bits you want to keep. And don't forget to remove the seams, the little mould seams on there, which you can do by just gently scraping your knife over them until they've gone flat. That's sometimes easier than sanding. So now we have all of our parts cleaned up. One of my tips would be to keep all the parts for the left part of the aeroplane together and all the parts for the right part of the aeroplane, including those, together in 2 separate piles so you know what goes where and you don't mix them up. And what we can do now that they're all cleaned up is we can paint these first parts that are going in here. The reason we're going to paint them before we glue them on is that once we've glued them on, we might accidentally get paint on the rest of our model. So to keep everything nicely painted and not have any accidents, we're going to paint that now. So I've already mixed my paint with some water, and we're just going to paint the bottom part of the part. So don't worry about the bit you're holding, because we can paint that once it's glued in. So as much as that. Now if you can find a bit of blue tack, that's a really good way of holding it, but a peg will do. Whatever you can find really to stop the wet paint touching your working top. Now on this smaller bit, the short bit goes in here and isn't very accessible, so paint the short bit and hold on to the long bit. And we can paint the tail wheel as well, and we can paint the inside surface of these parts as well. And it's actually easier to paint them if you can put them on some blue tack. If you can't, then paint the bottom half while you're holding it, let the paint dry, and then come back and paint the top part. It just means it takes you a little bit longer to paint it, but it's not a race, so it really doesn't matter. Now only paint that one side because it'll be this fuselage colour on the other side. You may need 2 coats for these parts because you've got a bigger surface area. You might see a little bit of unevenness and brush strokes, but you now know what to do. Let it dry, thin your paint a little bit more, and then paint over it. I'm also painting the bomb at the same time, just to show you how you can paint one half, let the paint dry, and then paint the other half. And whilst we have our paint out, we can also paint the centre of our wheels. Again, blue tack will make it really easy, but you can hold the tyre edge for this one, so we don't need to worry too much. We'll be painting the tyres later on. So paint over the edge is my advice, and then when you paint your tyre, you know that if you don't get right up to the edge, there's no plastic showing. So we now have a couple of parts to glue on that need to be painted the same colour as the underside of the aeroplane. We've got a tail wheel to go on, and we've got this little telescopic step to go on. So we'll paint the wheel, and then we'll glue the step on, and then paint it once the glue's dried. So I have the wheel here, and you can see I've given the tyre one coat of black already. Now some of this part disappears into the aeroplane not to be seen, so you don't need to paint all of the tab. You can leave a bit on the end if you wish. If you're not sure where it finishes, then paint it all just to be sure. If you've got a steady hand and you feel confident enough with this brush that's probably a little too big for the job really, you can have a go at painting the wheel hub in this colour as well. The trick is to not have too much paint on your brush. And I've actually just dabbed the step into the glue, just because it's a little bit quicker than putting the glue on with the stick, and then very carefully put it in place. We'll just leave that to dry, and while that glue is drying we can paint the outside of these parts which cover the wheels. You remember we've painted the inside, but we can now go and paint the outside. So as before, use a bit of blue tack if you've got some, otherwise paint one half first and then the other half. So we want to glue these landing gear into place now. First thing to say is to make sure that you get them the right way round. On this aeroplane, the wheels are on the inside, not the outside, so the little bar here points inwards. So just put them in without any glue at first, just to test fit them, and understand in your head how this is going to go on and make sure it all fits. So this part here that I'm just doing now is actually a little bit fiddly, and it's not clear in the instructions exactly how it fits. So when you test fit it, you can work that out. And we're actually going to start by putting some glue on the little lump that the part sits on. And holding it by the long end, we can put that in place there like that. And then we can dip this end in the glue and place it in the hole. And then you should be able to put a small amount of glue on your cocktail stick and attach that end onto your landing gear. Like so. It is probably the trickiest part of building this model, I would think. Now we need to make sure that the glue is set hard before we put the wheels on, but we've got some painting to do with the wheels, so let's do that and paint the tyres.